Hi, Lenny. Great to see you.
Richard, it's a pleasure. Unfortunately, not in person in Berkeley.
Yeah, that's right.
Like last time,
We're,
but still
we're old
wonderful to see
friends.
you.
We go back. So,
And
Lenny, I'm looking forward to a great half an hour chat with you about PhDs, starting companies, and what it's like to start a company out of a PhD background. And do you want to start maybe with your story about how you got started, what PhD track you chose, and then just a brief bio of where you are now?
yes, so very quickly, my background is in yeast genetics, and I went through both experimental and computational biology research as a PhD student in Berkeley. And then I went to do a postdoc, and I love teaching. I love research. I had no entrepreneurial ambitions. So there was no seed at any point in that 10-year journey where I was thinking I'll have a startup at some point. So I'll talk a little bit more during our discussion about the conversation, but my background is in genetics research, and it was totally by chance that the protocols thing happened. And what was your path like?
Yeah, I mean, I really actually can't wait to dig into that, because I do think that spark is such a fascinating one. So my story, I grew up in England, and I fell in love with philosophy actually as a subject as a teenager. And I applied to Oxford to study philosophy, politics, and economics, and got in, and then stayed my undergrad, master's, and PhD. So philosophy is a huge love, always has been for me, still is actually. But my second passion in life is starting companies. Might seem a bit incongruous, and we can get into that, but I do love starting companies. And alongside my PhD, I started 4 companies actually. They were all sort of side projects. And I did them in the holidays, the vacations from my Oxford PhD. The first 2 companies were food companies. First one was actually called Richard's Banana Bakery, and I was baking banana cakes in my mum's kitchen in London and selling them in cafes and offices in London. And the second one was a sandwich company. I was the head chef, head marketer, had everything, making sandwiches, selling them in offices in London. And then I decided to start a couple of tech companies, still in the PhD program, but I started in the vacations, a Craigslist-style accommodation website at Oxford, and then a Facebook app when the first Facebook platform launched. And then and the spark for academia, actually, that was the 5th company, came when I was finishing my PhD, and I had all these papers I'd written. And I thought, well, I want a homepage now. I want to put these papers up, make them freely accessible. And I'm proud of them now. I want to share them with the world. And Oxford at the time offered you about 1 gigabyte of web space, but you had to basically FTP the files to the server yourself. You had to write the HTML and CSS yourself. And I remember thinking that that's kind of a pain, and wouldn't it be nice if it was just a 1-click way to get your papers online? So I thought, I'm going to start that company. And it was closely aligned with A, my passion for entrepreneurship, and B, my passion for research. And it was, the philosophy was obviously completely separate from what the company I was starting. It sounds like in your case, there's much closer connection, Lenny, and that's super interesting to get into. But so I raised money from London venture capital firms, and then moved out to San Francisco and started academia. We can get to that story.
I had no idea you had started food companies during the PhD. And total aside is I was planning to pause my PhD for a year and start a sandwich lunch shop in Berkeley. I wrote down the menu. I had this whole idea for exactly what I wanted to do with it, and I never did it. Unfortunately, but I literally wrote down the menu and was planning for how I would launch a little shack next to Berkeley and then get back into the PhD once it's established. But I think maybe graduate. Sorry?
Lenny, what was the, I'm very happy to tell you my story of food, but what was your story of what gave you the idea of that sounds interesting? What made you sort of think in those ways?
I did traveling despite being in a graduate program. We've always loved to travel with my wife. And I was always thinking that most places serve one and the same thing every single day. And in Berkeley, you have so many options. As a lab, we'd never go out to lunch to the same spot because, well, we had that yesterday. We had Thai yesterday, we had Mexican the day before. Let's go get Ethiopian today, right? And I thought, well, what if you varied the menu? And if there was a place with a great vibe, but that every day you could come in and try different ethnic food, you could come back to that place every day. So that was the seed there. And the menu was like, what would be the different cuisines on different days? And I was really excited about it. And then I realized that the costs of not buying in bulk and cooking the same thing are what would totally bring that under and make it completely unsustainable, even if a fun place to come back to day after day. So that's why I stuck with the PhD rather than doing that.
I mean, I'll tell you mine. So my little segue into the food industry. So I just finished my master's. I spent like 3 years undergrad, 2-year master's, and I hadn't done anything really entrepreneurial in those 5 years, actually. I'd done other things. I'd sort of been traveling a bit, but nothing entrepreneurial. And after 2 years of like the beef, it's called the BPhil at Oxford. Like, it's quite an intense master's. And it was a summer vacation, like 4 months, between the BPhil and what they at Oxford called the DPhil, which is the PhD. And I was just desperate to like sell something during that summer. I just really wanted to like get out of abstract land and get into like, I just really wanted to sell something. And I thought, what can I sell? I just wanted that experience of selling. And I thought, should I sell like flowers door to door, just buy them from like, say Sainsbury's in the UK is a kind of safe way of it. And then a family friend had this great recipe for banana cake. And I thought, that is such an amazing banana cake. I think I can sell that. And I thought, should I sell it like street selling? And actually the first thing I did actually was to try and street sell banana cake. Just get out there in London with a tray and I had labels and all that and branding. And then, but then that progressed to kind of cafes and offices and, so that for me, it's interesting to sort of think about like PhD versus entrepreneurship. And for me, it was like, in some ways, it was the polar opposite. I wanted to get out of abstract land. Philosophy is extremely abstract into something super duper practical. In your case, Lenny, so you had that sort of brief kind of dream of a sandwich shack, but you put that aside and then you carried on and finished the PhD. And what happened? And then you did a postdoc, I think. What happened? What was the spark that led to protocols? So
that the protocols part, and for those who don't know, protocols.io, and you should also say what academia.edu is today. So maybe before I answer that question, I'll say what protocols.io is today, and you should say what academia is for those who don't know. But protocols.io is a central place to collaborate on method development, keep track of exactly what are the steps of the research methods that you're using, and a central place to make it easy to share those details with others, either privately or publicly as a knowledge base and repository. So an attempt to improve reproducibility in research in a central place. So it's both a tool and a public repository. And academia.edu?
I mean, I'll just say one thing. I've always loved protocols and I've always loved the pitch. And I just think it's so fantastic because, whatever everyone says when they're reading methods sections, like, how am I supposed to reproduce this paper? Like, I'm missing all these details. Like, what on earth am I supposed to do? And I love the fact that you're kind of owning that space and saying, okay, we're going to get really detailed here. We're going to say exactly what you have to do and just blow out the method section. And so I've always loved it. And I think it's a key idea. So with academia, where we are today is very similar to what I originally wanted the site to be, which is I originally wanted to sort of have a homepage where I could share my own research. And it's a platform where academics can share their own research. About 120 million people, or 100, actually now it's like, let me think, 140 million people now join the site. About 140,000 people join each day, actually. So it's growing very rapidly. About sort of 60 million people come to it each month to access the research papers that people have uploaded, and about 23 million papers have been uploaded and made freely available by the authors of those papers. And our goal is for every single paper ever written to be on the internet available for free. We think that open access is a wonderful thing. We think that papers historically have been behind these very expensive paywalls where, if you're in a university, you have access to this elite resource of the world's premier knowledge, and then you leave university and you lose your institutional subscriptions and your logins, and it's like you're kind of like Wikipedia, Google, and but the elite knowledge. And I just think that the whole world could, we're seeing professionals using the site and students using the site and the general public using the site. So the vision is that everyone in the world should have access to and be able to stay abreast of research that they find relevant to their daily activities.
And by the way, just a lot of credit to you for having a vision for what you wanted way back when you were doing the PhD, right? And a lot of startups that you come across, they pivot, they have an idea, realize it's a bad one, and that's a normal thing to do. And of course, there are a lot of things we need to adjust as startups with business models, with marketing, with functionality that's there. But I'm always impressed when I come across people like you or Elizabeth Irons of Science Exchange who have an idea and they really see it through, and it's a good idea from the beginning. And years in, you're like, oh, it's still a good idea, and other people need it, and other people are using it. I do also have respect for that, and it's great to hear that you had that original vision, and that actually is what academia.edu is today, right? So that it's not just faculty who can have their lab site, their webpage hosted by the university, but students, postdocs, right, and people who are not afforded that university space can have a place to share their research and what they're interested in, and sort of have a little website as a researcher.
So, Lenny, do you want to talk about, do you remember to this moment that sort of feeling of the penny dropping, and you thinking, gosh, there's a problem to be solved here. I need to start a company. Do you sort of remember that penny dropping in your mind?
I do. I remember that moment, but it wasn't like, oh, I just, had a vision from the heavens of what needs to be done. It was more my co-founder and the CTO of Protocols.io, Alexei Stolarchuk, giving me a call on January 7th of 2012. So I remember the moment. I was in Trader Joe's in Cambridge, not far from MIT, where I was doing the postdoc. And he just called me while I was in the checkout line preparing for my daughter's birthday the next day for the party we're hosting. And he asked, hey, is there a mobile app we can build that would be helpful for scientists like you? And he was director of engineering at Yahoo at that point. He's had startup experience and he was building apps on the side. And my first gut reaction was actually, no, I think it's kind of useless in the lab unless the phone can do pipetting for me. And then when I had paid for the food and I was coming to the car, I called him right back and said, well, but there is this one thing where I keep messing up the experiments that I'm doing. And my lab notebook is essentially writing the same experiment down over and over with little tweaks to try to get it to work. And, it would be helpful if I had not just a printout, but if I had the protocol on an app and I could see where I am, what I'm doing next, and make sure that I'm following the recipe correctly. And then if I made any changes, I could record it right in the app, so I don't have to write it over and over into the lab notebook. That would save me some time and prevent some errors. And that's not a grand vision for a knowledge base or repository. That was the initial conversation. And as I got more and more excited about the idea of that app being created, I realized it was 3 weeks later, I called Alexei back and I said, wait a second, if we did build this and people were using it and keeping track of what they're changing in protocols, could we give them a share button so that they could share those changes, optimizations, and corrections with everybody else? And that's the moment where it changed from a little app that's a side project to, wait, we could create a sort of knowledge base, Wikipedia or GitHub for science methods, where they're centralized, up to date, you have conversations, collaborative. So that's that moment, but it didn't happen with like, this is what I need on day one. So there was a transition. And this Spark that sort of is the context for this that you asked for is my postdoc experience, where I spent a year and a half troubleshooting a method, single cell microscopy method that I was using as a postdoc. And literally it was one step of that protocol that needed to be changed. So instead of a microliter of a chemical, it needed 5, and instead of 15-minute incubation, it needed 1 hour. But if you don't do that, all of your single cell results are wrong, what you're imaging in the microscope. And it took me a year and a half to figure out that tiny little tweak, right? Specifically for yeast. If you use that method for flies or mice or human cells, it's fine. In yeast, this is what you need. And you realize that's not a new paper. That's not a new technique, the way publishing works. And you were talking about open access and just the way we've been doing things versus the way we should be doing and sharing. And that realization that I've now done a year and a half, but it's not a new paper. I can't go and correct what's in Nature Methods. And everybody else who's using, not only do I not get credit for this, but everybody else who's using that same technique is either getting misleading results or has to spend a year or two rediscovering and making the same optimization. So that's what led with this sort of partially unhealthy obsession with creating this place and starting protocols.io. But I wonder what your experience, so mine was not a desire to have a company, but sort of just this path towards having Spark and then realizing, oh, I have an opportunity with my co-founder to create this platform that can benefit humanity, is really what I was thinking about. And then, of course, there's a lot to learn on the company side on how do you get funding. You said, oh, we went and got venture capital. That's not trivial, right? You go and do it, but trivial it's not. And my question to you is, like, what have you learned in starting academia.edu? Not what have you learned, we all learn a lot, right? But the question is, what enabled you to succeed with academia.edu? That's because you did a PhD that prepared you well for these things. And what do you think were the gaps that you wish you knew, you wish you had before you started academia.edu? Or maybe there were no gaps.
It's a great question, Lenny. So I think that there is actually a kind of similarity in some ways between like philosophy and entrepreneurship. So in philosophy, what you're trying to do is you're examining these concepts, right? These super basic concepts in life, like free will or knowledge, causation, just concepts that are kind of like really integral to our sort of conception of the world and ourselves, identity over time. And we use these concepts like in every sentence that we speak every day, effectively. It's one of these core concepts. And we make these rational transitions between these concepts at high speed. And philosophy is about slowing down the rational transitions and sort of like looking for glitches. And when you get a glitch, you're like, let me just sort of, sort of examine that a bit more closely under the microscope. And maybe there's a problem there. Maybe actually like X doesn't entail Y. We think it does, and we move from X to Y with great sort of alacrity, but maybe actually X doesn't entail Y. And that's all about slowing the mind down. And I think actually in entrepreneurship, it's sort of similar, that we kind of acclimate our behavior to these like massive problems in life. And like there's the elephant in the room, but we kind of like, sort of just so used to sort of adapting that we almost don't notice the elephant in the room and the massive pain point. And I think entrepreneurship and problem spotting is about kind of slowing the mind down and noticing, oh my God, there's like a giant problem here. Everyone's like, in your case, everyone's sort of battling about how to how to actually avoid spending a year or a half perfecting a particular protocol. And in fact, everyone in the world who's a scientist is probably facing that. And in my case, it was like, I remember, in fact, being on the phone, the sort of spark for academia was like being on the phone with a friend of mine and sort of lamenting, oh, I've got to create a homepage for the next few days. I've got to write HTML. I've got to like design it. I've got an FTP file or something. It was kind of like this admin hassle. And then I remember thinking, oh, let's zoom in on that. Like maybe other people feel this sort of admin hassle thing. And then maybe everyone feels that. And so that was the kind of similarity, I think, between philosophy and entrepreneurship. It's both about slowing the mind down. I think in my case, the fact that Oxford PhDs are basically they give you 6 months of vacations every year. In the humanities PhD program, it's like summer's a 4 months of vacation. Christmas and Easter is like 6 weeks each, and you're getting 6 months off. And you can work on your PhD, and you're not required to. The term's 8 week long, and the three terms. I actually found it was good for my PhD, like good for my creativity as a philosopher, and B, good for my emergence as an entrepreneur and just testing stuff, to just use those holidays to be able to try stuff and fail without embarrassment. And so I found those like those vacations as sort of sandboxes of like, what is it like to be an entrepreneur? What's it like to sell? With the banana cake business, it was definitely not enough to pay rent, and it was not supporting me in any way. But my main identity and the scholarship I was on was very much for me as a PhD student. So it wasn't really, I didn't have very high expectations, and it was okay to achieve what I was going to achieve. So I take the view that university is actually quite a good environment in which your primary identity is a student, but you can experiment on the side with things where it's okay if you fail. It's okay if you do things that don't pay the rent and, big flops, or just very minor successes. Like I think my banana cake company made like £100 a week in revenue. It's like $150 a week.
That's a lot of startups don't achieve that for many years, if ever, being actually profitable.
But it just gave me so many lessons. And none of those initial startups were venture funded. So they were all like just pure kind of like hustle. But I'll sort of stop there.
If I can just pick up on what you said around, being a student and just being able to experiment and fail, it's really close to what I think has helped me out of the PhD into transitioning into the startup world. I've actually written a blog post called PhD is Perfect for a Startup many years ago, when I realized, a couple of years into protocols.io, I realized just how many similarities there are between creating a startup and what the skills that you need and what we get in the PhD, that we almost subconsciously, like we don't necessarily even notice it, the skills that we pick up and what we gain. I think that I'm learning about this particular part of yeast chromosome 3 and how the genes work in there. And I think that that's my worth as a scientist, is what I know about that segment, because my knowledge is so deep about that subject. But you pick up a lot of other things. And I think one of the key things that are good about a PhD is that experimenting and failing. And in science specifically, it's fail, 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 fail. Your experiment succeeds, and then you realize actually you thought it succeeded, but it didn't. So then it's more fail, fail, fail to get to a result. And it's humbling, but you get used to the failure, right? And picking yourself up and thinking, well, maybe I can do it in a different way. That experiment didn't yield the results. Did I do the right control? Did I ask the right question? Maybe I can get at the knowledge that I want in a different way. And that's what startups are. I don't know if you have a similar feel, but we have ideas at protocols.io all the time, like this will be great, this will make people come, and then it's a total flop. And then you think like, okay, so why didn't that work? What are people thinking? What else do we need to try? And startup is just a series of experiments, most of them failing, right? But as long as the idea is good, eventually you figure out a way to get the message across in the right way and to get the audience, right? And you pick up these things, but there's a lot of experimenting.
Yeah, I love that, Lenny. I mean, I love this idea of like the autonomy as being a sort of strong analog. Like you're very much, I mean, maybe it depends on the field, but like there's a certain degree of autonomy as a PhD student. You got to choose your own direction, and you're in charge of some degree of your direction. Certainly in the case of my PhD, it was like, in the humanities PhD, you have to sort of choose your subject and choose your thesis title and just, you're given guidance by your PhD supervisor. But there's a lot of autonomy. One thing I'd love to chat to you about, Lenny, is as you're sort of finishing your PhD, and in your case, you went to the postdoc, you've got these dueling identities at this point. You've got the identity of a sort of research track person and your love of biology, and you're sort of like, should I go into a tenure track and should I become a faculty member? And you've got this like nascent idea about protocols. And it's like, how can I do both? Should I switch? How did you sort of keep both options open for a bit or finally make the switch? What did that decision look like?
For me, that's the identity you're talking about. I had an identity as an academic. I saw myself as, after my sort of lowest point during the PhD, in my fourth year when I was thinking of dropping out, I'm not a good scientist, imposter syndrome, really full force. And what else can I do? I'm just going to be a programmer. I'll apply and I should just cut my losses. Science is not for me. After I came out of that, the identity was really strong going into the postdoc. Like, wait, I have ideas now. I know what I want to do over the next 15 years, the topic I want to pursue. I can imagine having my own lab and having that identity. And then protocols.io starting on the side with Alexei doing it full time, us raising a little bit of money for him to quit his CTO position at another startup. And for a little while, for a year, I was under the illusion that I could do both. So I would continue my postdoc, advise the protocols.io effort. Alexei would just build it. It goes viral. People start using it. And I continue my research, apply for faculty positions. And we have this wonderful thing on the side. And the reality is you have to pick one or the other when it's an effort that big. So after a year, I realized I'm either going to fail at two things or I have to pick one of them and succeed at one of them. And that point, right, because my identity is scientist who is trying to become a faculty, right, with the lab, that was really hard making that decision. The realization that it's one or the other, for me, was one of the hardest decisions in this whole protocols.io journey. And what swayed me in the end, personally, in my case, what swayed me in the end was just thinking, there's so many PhDs competing for faculty positions. If I don't become a professor at Rutgers, somebody else will. It won't go empty for the next 20, 30 years. And they might be a little bit worse, same, or a little bit better than me, but there are a lot of talented people who can fill that spot. But I have an opportunity with Alexei to create something that doesn't exist. And people have been trying to create it for the last 15 years or 20 years and failing because they were too early for different reasons, right? The same good idea. But I might succeed. And if I don't, it might be another 20 or 30 years before something like this comes to fruition. And that's what swayed me into the entrepreneurial side and into protocols.io. So I don't have regrets, but I wonder, in your story, it sounds like you were already exploring, right? During the philosophy PhD, you were already exploring, like, what else could I do? So you were much smarter than me. Like, I had, this one track, I was going on it. I didn't envision it, but from your side, was there a decision? Like, wait, do I leave philosophy and do startup? Like, was it hard, or did you just jump into it when you had the spark for the homepage that a student needs?
Yeah, I mean, it was tough actually, and you know, there were these sort of two strong passions in my life at the time, and I was on this fellowship at the time that was a 7-year fellowship, and I'd used the first 2 years of that fellowship to finish the PhD. It was a very unusual fellowship where you could kind of like stay on the fellowship but not be an academic. You could switch into a non-academic track. And so what I decided to do was I said, look, so I had 5 years left on the fellowship. I said, I'm going to spend the next 2 years of the fellowship on the non-academic track and studying academia. And, I've been doing entrepreneurship on the side, for the last few years, and I'm doing philosophy as my main thing. I'm now going to switch. I'm going to do entrepreneurship kind of 100% of the time and for a couple of years and see where I end up. And if it's a total flop, then I've got 3 years left of the fellowship to write papers, go back into the academic track. And I actually felt at the time, still felt I would have been very happy as a philosophy professor. So what happened was I had given myself that permission to do that, and after 2 years, academia was getting going. There was traction. We'd raised money, and things were working out. And I mean, it wasn't easy, but things were going. We were making progress.
Did you know how long it would take you for academia to become successful? Like, going into it, what was your expectation? I thought protocols.io, in the beginning, as I said, I thought it would be just a side project that just takes off on its own. I tell my friend what to build, he builds it on the side, and then it goes. And then we realize, oh, he can't build it on the side. If we want it to be built, we need to raise money. We raise money. And then we realize it's more than just building it. It needs me as well, full time. So our expectations weren't exactly what it actually takes for most companies to build something from ground up, get traction, get revenue, get people to use you. What was your expectation going into academia.edu at that point? You said, I'll give myself 2 years. Mm-hmm. How long did you think it should take for it to be not requiring you?
It's funny you asked that. When I sort of go back through my memories, I think the state of my mind at the time was somewhat similar to yours, actually, in describing your mobile app sort of realization in Trader Joe's, which was I had this problem. It's big enough. It's a pretty big problem. It's not the size of a Google size problem. It doesn't affect everyone on the planet, but it affects most academics in the world. So that's a big, meaty problem. Seems worth tackling. And that was the limit of my thinking. I wasn't thinking, will a company IPO? I wasn't thinking, how many users will it have? What will be the business model? I mean, I did have to write a business plan. And I suppose, in fact, in writing that 80-page business plan for the first round of funding, actually, that was another sort of skill set that perhaps transferred between the PhD and the startup. And I did have to kind of obviously come up with forecasts at that point, but you have no idea how to forecast the revenue of a company that when you've never started a company. And so I would say that the sort of mental state was more found a problem. It feels pretty meaty, feels pretty exciting. And in some ways, I don't think I had sort of particular expectations. One question I have for you, Lenny, is when you made that decision, that brutal decision, to go all in on one of them, and you chose protocols, that in some ways the commercial world and the academic world are kind of chalk and cheese, also oil and water. They're pretty different, and the networks are different. I mean, there are some overlaps and some skill sets, but the networks are very different, and raising money from venture capital is again a different network, a different set of documentation. How did you find that first raise? How did you sort of make that transition to being a sort of CEO of a startup?
I think in many ways similar to going into the PhD, where I was going in as a math major who had never done any biology into a biology program with this thought like, well, how hard can it be? If I can do math, I can pick up biology, right? Like, and then you start doing experiments and being in the lab, and it's very different. And it's not just even about math into biology. I think all of us, when we go into a PhD, we think it'll be easier than it is. And that realization, the naivete, and then you learn, and then you get into then that moment of like, oh, wait, I can do this. So I think the same thing applies for protocols.io. I wasn't thinking like, oh, I'll be a great CEO. It's like, well, there's a problem. The company needs me on it. We'll see if I can do it or not. But there was a little bit of naivete, like, well, how hard can it be to get funding for this? It's hard to get money in academia on grants, right? There's so many more VCs than there are funding sources like NIH. So if one says no, you go to the next one. How hard can it be? And then years later, you're like, oh, whoa, that's hard. I had no idea how hard it is to raise venture capital. So part of it is just learning on the job. But again, I think as PhDs, we have that experience of learning on the job, right? And if you become professor, you learn on the job, like how to manage people, how to get equipment, how to apply for grants, right? The whole PhD story and academic story is a lot of learning. And I think if you're okay with learning, right, and picking things up and confronting insecurity that we all have, that I think helps. What about from your side? I know we're kind of pushing it on the clock here. We can talk for another few hours, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in my case, I was in Oxford at the time, and I was sort of taking the train down to London, and I sort of trying to build a new network, especially to raise venture capital. Like, you sort of go to these networking events, and I'd try and work the room. I'd try and meet like every single person in the room, basically, and then like the next morning I'd follow up with every single person, and it took a lot of time, a lot of work, and a lot of redrafting of the business plan, actually, in response to sort of feedback. But you know, and several months of just hard grind, like building a new network and following up on every single, like, hey, do you want to meet my friend Jessica? Yeah, yes, please. You know, and you never know what that'll lead to, but always take it. Yeah, so in the last few minutes, Lenny, do you want to sort of quickly give a picture of like what are you working on right now at Protocols? Are you looking to hire any particular positions that, you know, anyone watching this video might be like, yeah, I'd love to join Protocols and help them out on that project?
So it's an unusual year because of the pandemic. So a lot of our effort has been on helping and facilitating people who are working on coronavirus research, helping them share the methods. So despite the shutdown and a real slowing down of basic research that has happened during the spring, there's been a lot of traffic to protocols.io and a lot of sharing, particularly around the coronavirus research. So this is an unusual year where we've been paying a lot of attention to that. But that aside, what we have to do over the next 2 years is what we've had to always do at protocols.io, which is thinking about not just the tool and not just the functionality in it, but also thinking about sustainability and the business side, which you said you had to write on day one of the business plan for academia.edu. We also did a business plan back in 2012 when thinking about this, and we wrote some models and they were all wrong. And so the truth is that our revenue is going up finally, but it took a lot longer, not just to build and get adoption and get people to share, but it takes a lot longer to get to sustainability than you imagine naively going into this. So over the next year or two, a lot of the focus is on making it sustainable so we don't have to continue applying for grants and venture funding to survive. And I think academia, when you and I met, had just crossed that critical point of becoming sustainable, and that my hat is off to you. That is an incredible moment, right? But since you've crossed that line, what are the next big things for academia.edu?
Yeah, that's so we are profitable, and things we're working on right now are, one, we're actually launching a new publishing initiative at academia. So this is called Academia Letters, and you can publish short pieces, 800 to 1,000 word pieces. You get peer reviewed in 7 days, and two faculty members in the field of your paper have to like stamp the paper as like, I accept this for publication, and bang, it's published. We published one paper already, so anyone who wants to come and join, any particularly product managers and designers who want to come and help us out on that, scaling academia letters. And the second thing we're just launching, which is academia videos. So academics can upload their video to academia, their Zoom lectures, their conference presentations. So anyone who wants to help us think about like how to push the frontiers of academic research, not just from PDFs, but now include video. And we're excited to work with anyone on that.
Videos are also a big theme for protocols.io for the next year or two. We're trying to push that as well, because with reproducibility specifically, it can help a lot.
Well, I think that we're at time, Lenny. I've much enjoyed the chat. It's great to see you as always, and really fun discussion.
This was an absolute pleasure. And if we can have 30 more seconds, maybe I can just tell the audience, if you're a PhD or a postdoc and you're thinking, what are the possible jobs for me out there? You know, this was a conversation between two startup founders, but I think in general, one of the big lessons for me coming out of academia into protocols.io is just how much society values scientists and people with PhDs, not for the particular gene that you studied, right? Not for the topic you were focused on for the 6 years, but for the fact that you have a PhD and you have this training and you have the ability to take risks and learn and think, you know, if it's a science PhD, think as a scientist about experiments, the ability to write your thesis, right? So all the skills, all that you have actually opens you up to many different jobs that you can have. And it's not necessarily easy to explore. It is work to think like, what could I do? And, you know, thinking of the network, looking at other people. But the key point is you have a lot of skills that you might not even realize that you have.
Great message. Thanks a lot, Lenny. Great to chat.
Richard, it was an absolute pleasure.